In the shadowed annals of Renaissance Italy, where the sacred and the profane danced a terrible waltz, few names conjure such a potent cocktail of glamour, sin, and tragedy as that of Borgia. It is a name that has become a byword for corruption, nepotism, and ruthless ambition. At its dark heart stand two men: Rodrigo Borgia, who ascended to the papal throne as Pope Alexander VI, and his fearsome son, Cesare, the blueprint for Machiavelli's prince. Yet, caught between these grinding millstones of masculine power was another figure, a woman whose own story has been so thoroughly overwritten by the crimes of her family that her true form is almost lost to history. She has been painted as a poisoner, a creature of incestuous desire, a femme fatale draped in velvet and villainy. But what if this portrait is a lie? What if the real story of Lucrezia Borgia is not one of monstrous agency, but of profound and agonizing victimhood? What if she was not the perpetrator of her family's sins, but their most exquisitely decorated sacrifice? To understand her life is to peel back centuries of slander and speculation, to look past the lurid fantasy and into the terrified eyes of a young woman used as the most valuable piece of currency her family possessed, a beautiful, fertile daughter in a world where marriages were the sinews of power. This is the story of how that currency was spent again and again until it was nearly broken. Lucrezia was born into a world that was already old with contradictions. It was April of 1480, and the man who was her father, Rodrigo Borgia, was not a king or a duke, but a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church. He was a Spanish transplant in the heart of Italy, a man of immense wealth, charm, and an utterly secular appetite for power and pleasure. Her mother was Venazia dei Catenii, a long-term mistress who bore Rodrigo 4 children who would survive to become infamous: Giovanni, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. In the corrupt ecosystem of the late 15th century papacy, the vow of celibacy was a quaint fiction, and a cardinal's illegitimate children, while a technical embarrassment, were a practical asset. They were extensions of his will, tools for dynastic aggrandizement. Lucrezia, from a moment of her birth, was therefore not simply a daughter. She was a strategic investment. She was raised not in the open court, but in the discreet comfort afforded to a powerful man's secret family, overseen by her mother and later by Adriana de Mila, a trusted cousin of the cardinal. Her education was befitting a noble woman of the highest rank. She was taught languages, music, poetry, and the delicate art of courtly comportment. She was, by all accounts, a golden child, fair-haired, graceful, with an easy charm that captivated those around her. But this education was not for her own enrichment. It was the careful polishing of a precious jewel before it was placed on the political market. The Italy of Lucrezia's youth was a fractured mosaic of competing powers. The Papal States, Milan, Venice, Florence, and Naples were locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance, forming and breaking alliances with the cynical speed of a card sharp. In this environment, a daughter of marriageable age was more valuable than an army. A strategic wedding could secure a border, win a powerful ally, or neutralize a threat without a single drop of blood being spilled, at least not on a battlefield. For a man like Rodrigo Borgia, whose ambition knew no earthly or spiritual bounds, his beautiful daughter was the key that could unlock any number of political doors. Her life's purpose was decided before she could even comprehend it. It was a reality she would have absorbed with the very air she breathed in the palaces of Rome. She saw how power worked, how women were moved across the geopolitical chessboard like queens in a game played exclusively by men. Her first betrothal was arranged when she was just 11 years old. A union contracted and then dissolved as her father's political calculus shifted. She was promised first to one Spanish nobleman, then another. These were mere preliminary sketches for the grand design her father had in mind. She was being held in reserve, waiting for the moment her value would reach its absolute peak. That moment arrived in August of 1492. In a conclave rife with simony and brazen bribery, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia achieved his life's ambition. He became Pope Alexander VI. The earth shifted beneath Lucrezia's feet. She was no longer the cherished but discreetly hidden daughter of a powerful cardinal. She was now the daughter of the Vicar of Christ, the supreme pontiff of Christendom. At the age of 12, her value skyrocketed beyond all previous measure. She was now the most desirable bride in Italy, a living symbol of papal favor. Her father, the Pope, wasted no time in cashing in this extraordinary asset. The swirling alliances of the Italian peninsula demanded his immediate attention, and the powerful Sforza clan of Milan were essential partners. To secure them, a new marriage was arranged for Lucrezia. Her previous Spanish engagements were swept aside. Her new fiancé was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man in his late 20s and a relative of the formidable Duke of Milan, Ludovico il Moro. For the Borgias, it was a spectacular success. For 13-year-old Lucrezia, it was the formal beginning of her life as a political pawn. The contract was signed, the dowry paid, and in June of 1493, a lavish wedding ceremony was held in the Vatican itself, a spectacle of wealth and power that announced the arrival of the Borgia papacy. Lucrezia, a child bride draped in finery, was formally handed over to her new husband, a man she barely knew, to serve a purpose she could only vaguely understand. She smiled, she danced, she played her part, but behind the public facade, the first threads of her personal tragedy were being tightly woven. Her life with Giovanni Sforza in the coastal city of Pesaro was a gilded cage. She was a duchess, surrounded by the trappings of nobility, but she was isolated and under constant scrutiny. Her husband was reportedly a man of coarse sensibilities, perhaps intimidated by the sophisticated Roman court from which his young wife had come, and certainly aware that his primary importance was as a link to her powerful father. Lucrezia performed her duties with the grace she had been taught, presiding over her small court. Yet, the political landscape of Italy was as volatile as the slopes of Vesuvius. Alliances were made of sand, and the one that had bound the Borgias to the Sforzas was beginning to crumble. Pope Alexander and his increasingly influential son, Cesare, were reorienting their strategy. They now looked toward an alliance with Naples and, more significantly, with France. In this new configuration, the Sforza connection was not just useless, it was a liability. Giovanni Sforza, once a valued piece in the Borgia puzzle, was now an obstacle to be removed. And Lucrezia, the human glue that held the alliance together, had to be unstuck. What followed was a masterclass in Borgia ruthlessness and a moment of profound and public humiliation for Lucrezia. Divorce was not an option, but an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation was possible. In 1497, the Pope convened a commission to dissolve his daughter's marriage. The official charge leveled against Giovanni Sforza was as devastating as it was intimate: impotence. He was accused of being incapable of consummating the marriage over the 4 years it had existed. Sforza was outraged. He knew the charge was a political fabrication, a convenient pretext to discard him. He fought back, claiming vehemently that he had consummated the marriage many times and that the Pope wanted Lucrezia back for his own purposes. It was here that the first dark whispers of incest began to circulate. Rumors that Giovanni himself may have helped spread in a desperate, spiteful act of revenge. He suggested the Pope wanted his daughter not for another political marriage, but for himself. The slander was monstrous, and it would cling to Lucrezia's name for centuries, a stain of poison applied by her own discarded husband and tacitly encouraged by her family's cynical maneuvering. The full weight of papal power was brought to bear on the Lord of Pesaro. His powerful Sforza relatives in Milan, seeing which way the political wind was blowing, abandoned him. He was isolated, threatened, and ultimately broken. Faced with utter ruin, Giovanni Sforza was forced to sign a confession, a document attesting to his own non-existent impotence and validating the annulment. To add a grotesque finality to the proceedings, Lucrezia was required to swear an oath that she was, indeed, a virgin. The entire affair was a legal and religious farce, played out on a public stage for the sake of political expediency. For Lucrezia, now 17, it was a harrowing ordeal. She was subjected to intimate physical examinations to prove her virginity and forced to participate in a lie that shamed her husband and made a mockery of the sacred vows she had taken as a child. She was a pawn being reset on the board, and the process was brutal and dehumanizing. The experience taught her a bitter lesson. Her body, her honor, and her life were not her own. They belonged to her father and brother, to be disposed of as they saw fit. During this period of turmoil, she retreated to a convent, a common practice for noble women in times of distress. But her seclusion was soon marred by another scandal, the so-called Roman infancy affair, where she gave birth to a mysterious child, Giovanni Borgia, whose paternity was deliberately obscured by papal bulls, attributing him first to Cesare and then to the Pope himself. The truth of the child's origin remains one of history's great enigmas, another layer of shadow and shame clouding Lucrezia's life. With the Sforza marriage officially erased, Lucrezia was once again available. The Borgias' new political alignment required a new marital bond, this time with the House of Aragon, which ruled the Kingdom of Naples. The chosen groom was Alfonso of Aragon, the Duke of Bisceglie, the handsome, 17-year-old illegitimate son of the late King Alfonso II of Naples. He was by all accounts a charming and gentle young man, and for the first time in her life, Lucrezia seemed to be entering a union that contained the promise of genuine affection. They were married in the summer of 1498, and the match appeared to be a happy one. The couple were of a similar age and temperament, and a real bond of love grew between them. Lucrezia seemed to have found a small pocket of peace amidst the treacherous currents of her family's ambition. For a brief, shining period of 2 years, she lived a life of relative normalcy and contentment in Rome. In 1499, she gave birth to a son, Rodrigo, named for her father. She had a husband she loved and a child she adored. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, this happiness. And like anything beautiful and fragile in the world of the Borgias, it was destined to be shattered. The architect of its destruction would be her own brother, Cesare. While Lucrezia had been navigating her marriages, Cesare had undergone a dramatic transformation. He had been made a cardinal against his will by his father, a path unsuited to his martial spirit and boundless ambition. In 1498, he cast off his cardinal's robes, an unprecedented act, and dedicated himself fully to the secular, military arm of the Borgia enterprise. With the backing of the new French king, Louis XII, Cesare began a ruthless campaign to carve out a permanent Borgia state in central Italy. This new, powerful alliance with France fundamentally changed the political map once again. Suddenly, Alfonso of Aragon, the Neapolitan prince, was no longer an asset. His family were now enemies of France, and therefore enemies of Cesare's ambitions. Lucrezia's husband had become a political inconvenience, a living reminder of an obsolete alliance. His very presence in the Vatican was an embarrassment and a threat. Lucrezia must have sensed the shift in the air, the cold wind blowing from her brother's camp. The warmth that had briefly entered her life was now threatened by the shadow of Cesare's ambition. Alfonso, too, was acutely aware of his precarious position. He was a man marked for death, living in the heart of his enemy's territory. In August of 1499, he fled Rome in disguise, leaving a pregnant Lucrezia behind. Her distress was immense. Her father, the Pope, perhaps trying to placate her, or perhaps playing a double game, feigned anger at Alfonso's departure and sent messengers to retrieve him. Eventually, Lucrezia persuaded her husband to return, promising him safety under the Pope's protection. It was a fatal mistake, a testament to her desperate hope that family bonds might still mean something against the cold logic of power. Alfonso returned to Rome and to his doom. For a few more months, the young couple maintained a facade of normality, but the atmosphere in the Vatican was thick with menace. Cesare Borgia, returning from his military campaigns in the Romagna flushed with victory and arrogance, made no secret of his contempt for his brother-in-law. The Neapolitan prince was a dead man walking. The end came with chilling premeditation on a summer evening in July of 1500. As Alfonso of Aragon left the Vatican after dining with the Pope, he was ambushed on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. A group of masked assassins fell upon him, stabbing him repeatedly. He was grievously wounded in the head, arm, and leg, but miraculously he was still alive. He was carried, bleeding profusely, back into the papal apartments. For the next month, Lucrezia and his sister, Sancha of Aragon, nursed him with frantic devotion. They lived in a state of siege within the Borgia Tower, refusing to leave his side. They cooked his food themselves, fearing that any meal sent from the papal kitchens would be laced with the poison for which their family was becoming notorious. Lucrezia, living through a waking nightmare, was desperately trying to hold back the tide of her brother's hatred with her own two hands. She was fighting to keep her husband, the father of her child, alive in the very den of his would-be murderers. It was a testament to her courage and love, but it was a futile struggle. Cesare was enraged that the initial attempt had failed. He grew impatient with the slow process of his brother-in-law's potential recovery. A contemporary chronicler reported that Cesare visited the wounded Alfonso and, seeing him on the mend, muttered with cold fury, "What is not accomplished at noon can be done at night." He would not be denied his objective. On August 18th, the final act of the tragedy was staged. On some pretext, Lucrezia and Sancha were lured from Alfonso's chamber. The moment they were gone, Cesare's most trusted and ruthless henchman, the dreaded Michelato Corella, entered the room with a group of armed men. They cleared the chamber. Then, as the 19-year-old Duke lay helpless in his bed, Michelato wrapped his hands around his throat and squeezed the life from him. Alfonso of Aragon was strangled to death, a victim of a political expediency so cold and absolute it defied comprehension. The murder of her husband, in her own home, at the hands of her own brother's agent, was the nadir of Lucrezia's existence. It was the most brutal and explicit demonstration of her utter powerlessness. Her happiness, her love, her role as a wife, all of it had been sacrificed on the altar of Cesare's grand strategy. The official story put out by the Vatican was that the Duke had died from sudden relapse caused by his earlier injuries. It was a transparent lie that no one in Rome believed for a second. Everyone knew who was responsible. But Cesare Borgia was now the most feared man in Italy, second only to the Pope himself. He operated with complete impunity. There would be no investigation, no justice for the murdered prince. Lucrezia was plunged into a profound and inconsolable grief. She was seen weeping, her public sorrow a silent, powerless accusation against her own family. Her father, Pope Alexander, seemed for once to be moved by his daughter's suffering, or at the very least, he recognized the political need to manage the fallout. He sent her away from the blood-soaked corridors of the Vatican to the fortress town of Nepi to mourn in seclusion. It was a period of deep despair, a time when she must have confronted the terrifying reality of her situation. She was 20 years old, a widow for the second time, her first marriage ending in humiliation, her second in a horrific murder. She was trapped, a prisoner of her own infamous name. Even in her grief, she could not escape her function. The Borgia machine was still in motion, and Lucrezia was still its most valuable diplomatic tool. As Cesare consolidated his duchy in the Romagna, a new alliance was needed, one that would cement the Borgia's power and lend their upstart dynasty an air of old-world legitimacy. The target was the ancient and prestigious house of Este, rulers of Ferrara, Medina, and Reggio. The proposed groom was Alfonso d'Este, the heir to Duke Ercole I of Ferrara. For the Este, the match was initially repulsive. The Borgia name was tainted with scandal, rumor, and the stench of murder. They were seen as Spanish parvenus, illegitimate and morally bankrupt. Duke Ercole resisted the proposal fiercely, viewing a union with the Pope's daughter as a stain on his family's honor. But Pope Alexander was persistent. He applied immense pressure, threatening the Duke with political isolation and the loss of territory. He offered a staggeringly large dowry, a king's ransom that the Ferrarese state desperately needed. The King of France, Cesare's ally, also pushed for the marriage. Trapped between papal threats and French persuasion, Duke Ercole eventually, reluctantly, capitulated. For Lucrezia, this third marriage was a complex proposition. It was another political command from her father, another instance of her life being dictated by the needs of the state. She was to be sent far from Rome, to a new court and a new husband who, she knew, was being forced to marry her. Yet, it also represented a chance, perhaps the only one she would ever get, to escape the direct, suffocating influence of her father and the terrifying proximity of her brother. Ferrara was a world away from the hothouse of intrigue and violence that was Borgia Rome. It was a chance for a new life, a chance to redefine herself away from the horrors she had witnessed and endured. She embraced the opportunity with a pragmatism born of deep suffering. She reportedly took a keen interest in the negotiations, particularly in the details of her own status and the splendor of her trousseau, perhaps seeing in these material assertions of her rank a way to build a fortress of dignity around herself. In January of 1502, Lucrezia Borgia left Rome forever. Her glittering procession snaked its way north, a spectacular display of wealth designed to awe her new family. It was the beginning of the final and most remarkable chapter of her life. Her arrival in Ferrara was met with suspicion and veiled hostility. She was the scandalous Borgia, the Pope's daughter whose last husband had been murdered. The Ferrarese court was formal and austere, a stark contrast to the more relaxed and ostentatious atmosphere of Rome. Her new husband, Alfonso d'Este, was a dour and martial man, more interested in casting cannons than in poetry or courtly love. He initially treated her with a cool correctness. But Lucrezia, now a veteran of court politics and a survivor of immense trauma, proved to be more than capable of navigating her new environment. She deployed the charm, intelligence, and grace that had been noted in her since childhood. Slowly, patiently, she began to win over the court and her husband. She proved herself to be not a monster of depravity, but a cultured, pious, and competent duchess. She established her own court, which became a celebrated center for artists, poets, and musicians, including the great Ludovico Ariosto. She was a shrewd administrator, and when Alfonso was away on military campaigns, she ruled Ferrara as regent with wisdom and skill. The people of Ferrara, who had dreaded her arrival, grew to love and respect her. This new life, however, was not an escape from tragedy. Just a year and a half after her arrival in Ferrara, the entire foundation of her family's power collapsed. In August of 1503, Pope Alexander VI died suddenly, likely from malaria, though rumors of poison, as always, swirled. At the same time, Cesare Borgia was struck down by the same severe illness. While he survived, he was incapacitated at the precise moment his political survival depended on his ruthless energy. Without the protection and authority of the papal throne, the Borgia Empire crumbled almost overnight. Their enemies, emboldened by the Pope's death, rose up. Cesare, a shadow of his former self, was stripped of his lands, arrested, and eventually exiled to Spain, where he was killed in a minor skirmish in 1507. The Borgia ascendancy was over. For Lucrezia, the news from Rome must have been a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The father who had both cherished and exploited her was gone. The brother whose ambition had cost her so much was defeated. The entire world that had defined and tormented her had vanished. She was now truly on her own, her survival entirely dependent on her position in Ferrara. It was a precarious moment. Her husband's family, who had been forced to accept her, could now have easily cast her aside. Her value as a political link to Rome was gone. But by this time, Lucrezia had made herself indispensable through her own merits. Alfonso d'Este stood by her. Her position was secure. The remainder of her life in Ferrara was a testament to her resilience. She had finally found a measure of autonomy and respect, but her existence was still stalked by loss. Her beloved firstborn son, Rodrigo, whom she had been forced to leave behind in Rome, died in 1512 at the age of 12. The news devastated her. She endured numerous difficult pregnancies, giving birth to several children for the Este dynasty, but also suffering miscarriages and stillbirths that took a heavy toll on her physical health. She turned increasingly towards piety, founding convents, and spending long periods in religious retreat. It was as if, after a life defined by the sins of others, she sought solace and purification in faith. The vibrant, golden-haired girl from Rome had transformed into a sober, respected, and deeply devout duchess. She had outlived the monstrous ambition of her father and brother and had built a legacy of her own, one of capable governance, cultural patronage, and quiet dignity. But the traumas of her youth had left indelible scars on her body and soul. In June of 1519, at the age of just 39, Lucrezia gave birth to her 8th child. The baby, a daughter, was stillborn. Complications from the difficult childbirth led to a raging fever. As she lay dying, she wrote a final, moving letter to the Pope, seeking his blessing and accepting her fate with a calm piety that would have been unrecognizable to those who knew her only through the dark legends. A few days later, she died. Her husband, Alfonso d'Este, who had once been so reluctant to marry her, was said to have been consumed by a grief so profound that he found it difficult to write the official announcement of her death. He had come to love and admire the woman who had been forced upon him. So, who was Lucrezia Borgia? Was she the incestuous plotter, the skilled poisoner with her hollow ring, the beautiful demon of Renaissance propaganda? The historical evidence suggests something far more tragic. The Lucrezia who emerges from the chaos of her family's history is a figure of profound suffering and remarkable endurance. She was a tool, an object, a piece of high-value property in the brutal marketplace of dynastic politics. Her body was a site of political negotiation, her marriages were treaties, and her happiness was a disposable commodity. She was publicly shamed, widowed by murder, and perpetually surrounded by a level of cynical violence that is difficult to comprehend. The stories of her wickedness were, for the most part, politically motivated slander, weapons used first by her own family to achieve their aims, and later by their enemies to posthumously destroy their reputation. The most potent poison in Lucrezia's life was not in a ring on her finger. It was in the very blood that ran through her veins, the blood she shared with a father and a brother whose ambition was a devouring fire that consumed everything it touched, including her. Her true legacy lies not in the lurid tales of sin, but in her quiet triumph in Ferrara. It is the story of a survivor, a woman who was forged in the crucible of Europe's most corrupt court, who endured the unimaginable, and who somehow managed to salvage from the wreckage of her youth a life of purpose, grace, and honor. She remains a haunting testament to the human cost of power, a perennial reminder that behind the grand tapestries of history, with their popes and their princes, are the silent, bleeding figures of those who were forced to pay the price.